Allow me to start by introducing our participants in the second roundtable here. This second roundtable will be looking into the prospects, into the outlook. Once again, the same principle, all groups are represented here. So we have Hubert Géraux with us. Hubert Géraux, you're an expert of World Wildlife Fund in New Caledonia. You were and are still lead of Nickel.Nc Group 1, Corporate Social and Environmental Responsibility, Best Practices and International Benchmarking. Good morning. Then Dominique, Lefeivre, I introduced you before. You're still with us for this second roundtable. Still lead on admin support, one-stop point of contact. You're former chair of commission on economic development and taxation at the Economic, Social and Environmental Council. Good morning again. Sébastien Lafargue, you also stayed with us for the second part of the roundtables. You're working as lead on optimizing resource and reserves, director of Société des mines de Tontouta, appointed by Syndicat des industries de la mine, Mining Industries Group. Then Pascal Velasco, you're also attending this second roundtable. You're in the group on skills development, deputy director in charge of training at GIEC. Mickaël, Jamet, you joined us now with the matter of the funder. What's a funder? And you're not a ghost, quite obviously. Your background is a little bit strange. You're director of taxation services, and you will lead on what fund for future generations. And then Vincent Ménard, you're a member of the board for the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and you were lead in the economic benefits of mining and metallurgical activities group. Thank you, Mickaël. Your background is now corrected. Well, Javier Capape told us many things, and I'd like to start with what we agree on, and I'd like to turn to you, Mickaël. Earlier on, when Javier Capape gave the answer as to what is required for a good fund, he said you need to start with a shared common knowledge base and share a vision. On the question of the fund, well, I'd like to say we already understand that you don't share the same views because the expectations are different. But would the Nickel.Nc approach contribute to creating this shared knowledge base? Or can you find yourself in this discussion and this debate now? Mickaël, Jamet, your microphone is not unmuted. You need to unmute your microphone. I made the same mistake earlier on. Good morning. Indeed, the analysis undertaken by Mr. Capape is quite useful. The work that was undertaken as part of our meetings here will certainly contribute to lay the groundwork for a broader reflection. Talking about a fund in particular, Mr. Capape said so, but we heard it before. There's a clear need for a consensus at the country level. As soon as such a consensus is established, not only amongst the politicians, but also for the population at large, there needs to be acceptance, total acceptance, with all the parties involved in the industry as well. Then we can talk about moving to a fund, and then what we want to do with that fund. Is that a long-term fund for future generations, a shorter-term fund for the immediate economic transformation? And that will then lead to a series of answers and then studies. And I believe that's all I can say at this stage. It's interesting because earlier on, Javier Capape was telling us sharing one or multiple aims or objectives. Unfortunately, for those who did not attend his interview, we can imagine a fund that would actually be the regulator of the nickel price, to be less exposed to up or downwards variations, make more money when the times are good, and then another objective that could be financing, economic diversification, or something else. So these are amongst the subjects. Just a small reminder, we're closing here during this roundtable on the outlooks. I can tell you that last week, journalists were in touch and said, well, all good and well, but what's going to happen from here? So there's three matters I'd like to address with you this morning. share this common knowledge base that Thierry Santa called for when he initiated this approach. He said, is it possible to actually work together, get to know each other on this subject? So do you have now the impression that you've gotten to know the matter better? And then the second question, the green nickel of New Caledonia, what prospects to actually generate value with that? And that's a real follow-on subject. Is that just a mindset question, or should we all integrate in New Caledonia and in the broader country? How can we distinguish ourselves from the 24 other producing countries? And then the third one is the human approach. So many of you have asked in this. We've had a productive discussion, and I would like to thank everybody. So where to from here? Do we keep going? Do we separate, go our respective ways? So on the fund for the future, I turn to Pascal Velasco again. In terms of prospects, can we expect a shared intention, or is there still more work to do? Is there an immediate prospect on training? We agree that's a future promise that's opening up. We want to pool resources. Where does it take us? Indeed, I think we need to look even further than that. Following this interview, it was quite interesting to hear this. You need to look beyond. I talked about 3 or 5 years earlier on, but future generations as well. Nickel is not an infinite resource. So the question of training, skills development, the question is how and who pays for it? These are the questions we can ask. You said, what's the cost? But then what's the timeline? If I may, I'd like to interrupt. We're always under the impression that we have this, that we agree on the idea that who's going to pay and who uses what. That's why I'm calling a spade a spade. It's useful to actually call it one day. What's quite interesting as well is to try and look beyond this. Same thing, it's like a business. Training, if you don't have a forecasting, if you don't have an outlook, if you don't manage it over time, you can't be operational. And that's what businesses hold up against us. They say these institutes do not react to needs. But if we don't have readability, if we can't anticipate and forecast, we can't do anything. Well, in terms of vision, that's the question that's being asked now. Well, you're amongst the leads, you're amongst the main actors of this entire approach, but it's asked around the community how to go about sharing a vision on this. Well, this forecasting of skills and trades is really a time-critical management. It's not just this right here, right now approach. It's a true management of the needs. It's looking into how you finance this in the future. It's actually forecasting costs. So it's really groundwork that needs to be done and that runs over a timeline. There was 3 of us working on this and we kind of were in agreement with the information we collected. This is really the tool for the industry that could facilitate development over time. You talked earlier on about the approach that was chosen in the collection of information within the groups. It's also the knowledge amongst us of what's happening in the different groups. Earlier on, people said how the trainings should go. I'm not sure that the people in the industry know nowadays what's available here in New Caledonia in terms of training. Right now, for instance, how do we train? How do we go about it? Well, this is a good question, because it's quite surprising to come to the end of a year of work, to have performed so many studies, 30, 40 studies that have never been put together in a single spot. What are we going to do with those? Hubert Géraux, I'd like to turn to you, because when we talk about sharing a vision, Javier Capapé tells us you need to look into the long term, 20, 30, 40 years. It's our children, their children. What do you understand? What do you hear here? And you are a lead in the group about CSR. Sustainability is relevant. Well, Javier Capapé talked about intergenerational justice. And when we talk about here, we talk about the third party that's missing. It's the third party that's not attending the conversation. They're not around the table. It's the future generation. And so all our thinking at some stage, and that's why it's useful to actually reflect outside the political space without political pressure to move forward, to make headway within the community, because this needs to go beyond the political timeline to actually work in a long-term timeline. This morning, the questions that were asked were discussing how reactive the industry must be with high volatility of costs. One morning you wake up, you're making money, the next day you're losing money. But at the same time, you cannot isolate the conversation and purely gear it towards nickel. Our thinking process needs to interact with all of the development vision for the territory. Let's not forget that when the land planning of New Caledonia was established, it actually replaced the mining planning. So that shows how isolated, how silo-like we were working. And nickel sits in its own little corner where it should actually be integrated between the industries and be integrated in an intergenerational thought process as well. Well, this is a subject that was addressed earlier on. This is this shared, this joint knowledge base. And this is certainly one of the conclusions that comes back all the time. Last week and during the roundtables, and Javier Capapé said there is a need for a shared knowledge base. One of the things that Javier Capapé was saying, it is necessary to share a common knowledge base. And if you highlight this with what Vincent Mardel was saying about the BRGM last week, he said, communicating, sharing the information, the discussion can only be enlightened when we have the same understanding of the terms. We know that we don't share the definitions. We know that many arguments arise from misunderstandings. And we, the Nickel.Nc community, what can we propose? What can we advance as a proposition to create a common good with these definitions? When we're talking about CSER, this is it. When we're talking about the reserve, this is it. How do you see things? Dominique Lefeivre, possibly, because the one-stop point of contract may be a part answer. Would you have any ideas to share on this? Well, my microphone wasn't unmuted. Well, once again, you need to be very ambitious for this single point of contact. As I said earlier on, it's not only about dropping off admin papers and applications. What we found is that we're starting to have data, but the problem of demand and the root cause problem, and I'm seizing the opportunity to say that here, is that New Caledonia and politicians need to follow a nickel policy. If we don't have a nickel policy, sorry? What do you understand when you say nickel policy? Well, nowadays everybody says nickel is important in New Caledonia, but nobody provides it with the means that are needed. The issue with the single point of contact is not established, and we heard it clearly when we were talking to Dominique earlier on, is that they don't have the means. So will we now decide to give the means to the nickel industry so that we can actually have access to all these data, to all these studies? So it's been said very clearly that they need manpower in the environment, manpower in CSER, and so they're looking for human resources. They need money to bankroll all this. Will the other directorates give them manpower? No, because we're currently in budget restrictions. So the politicians need to make a decision now. So this is needed in New Caledonia, so we'll make means available. Or Alternatively, because right now we're talking about simplifying the administration, and that seems to be solving quite a few issues, we entrust quite a lot of studies to independent contractors, to independent consultancy firms, telling them, for instance, to study this project, you have 3 months' time, and then DMAC can actually do a summary. After 4 months, we have a study that is worth its name. And that is quite important because there's matters that have been hanging around for a year because administration doesn't get back. The person in charge in the administration has gone on leave, and there's constant delays, and maybe that is the solution. We essentially outsource all this, and DMAC just then takes stock of what comes back. It will certainly be cheaper than hiring more civil servants. I'm not saying that, but that may be something. But maybe we will then get a result, and we'll get the data that we need and that we're expecting. So, 2 thoughts here, Vincent Ménard. I'd like to turn to you, the work done in your group as part of the ISE study that we've heard. You started with defining terms. What are we talking about? At the beginning of your work in your group, the question of the reference to the wealth produced, or GDP, was discussed widely. Now, today, if we look at what's the outlook of this shared knowledge base, how can this kind of feedback in the economic benefits of mining and metallurgical activities? Well, I'd just like to correct here, I'm technical advisor to CCI and not a member of the board. Now, and I'm specialized in environment and technologies. So indeed, our work confirmed more or less this study confirmed the 2012 study, excellent 2012 study, saying that 20% of jobs in the private sector are associated to nickel. And what was lacking, of course, in this study, since it was undertaken quite quickly, what was not considered here, for instance, was the impact on the public sector, which is quite relevant. So where there's important GDP. So when we start with a common knowledge base, certain things were not undertaken. The number of people, 15,000 people, for instance, working in the nickel space. Well, we need to know exactly what we're talking about. Private sector only. The public sector is missing. And then direct and first line indirect, second line indirect are not considered. So you need to bring this completely to the end, this study completely to its end, to really assess the relevance of nickel. And here you were talking about the relevance for GDP. Indeed, we're hearing a lot about a 5 to 6% impact. We should never disregard that this relevance depends on the LME price, which was quite low at some stage. The LME price, that's the price at the London Metal Exchange. So that's the reference price of nickel in the market, and to which certain percentages apply. Well, that's right. So it's the nickel price. And the nickel price has been much higher on occasion. And therefore, the relevance of nickel on GDP was higher at the time. And right now it's picking up again. We hope that it will keep picking up. And what we're hoping is to see a much higher relevance and much higher importance here. And when we talk about this terminology, we need to understand clearly when we say 5% of GDP, that sticks in the mind of people. That's from a time where nickel prices were really depressed, very low. And the worst of times was 5%, but it should pick up again. Well, is there a duty of information, a duty to report data about nickel? Hubert Géraux on the matter of CSIA, that's having a good knowledge of what each and everyone does a few kilometers apart. Is there a duty to inform, to report, and is there good practices in that space? Well, as part of our work on CSR, this is something that was regularly brought back by the parties, the stakeholders, this need for transparency, this expressed by the administration, by the mining companies. So if we want to build this common base, and here we're talking about a common knowledge base, not talking action, it's quite relevant to work on that dimension, because it all depends on the social license, not only for those people living nearby the mine sites, but also the social license overall in New Caledonia for this industry, which obviously has traditionally its place within New Caledonia, in the country, but has to be re-envisaged, rethought, possibly integrating in this knowledge base also the issues and the challenges in terms of conservation. Don't forget that we're in a biodiversity hotspot here around the world. We're kind of in an unlucky spot. The ore actually sits under ecosystems that are unique in the world, with a level of diversity that's unique in the world. So if we look at this 1/3 of land of Grande Terre, where the mining activity has taken place and is still looking to taking place, we've lost 90% of the wet forests there. So in terms of CSR, there is a need for visibility for the public, for transparency for the public, and it's important to understand what's the vision. Well, it's possibly not yet established. What's the political vision? What political vision we can build around developing the activity, but also in terms of ambition of preserving the natural capital, the renewable natural capital, so the biodiversity and the water, for it not to be destroyed. Well, it's quite interesting to see that this is one of the subjects, and I'm drawing a parallel to what Xavier Gravela was saying during the previous roundtable. He was highlighting the fact that as soon as you move resource, as you touch the surface, might as well go to the bottom of it to actually re-establish afterwards what you can when you're done mining. And that's a subject that we'll revert to later. Two questions that are bugging me now, and I'll start with possibly the simpler one. There's 25 nickel-producing countries around the world. New Caledonia is regularly mentioned as being in the top 5 or 6, even if it's more complicated depending on what you're talking, or processed nickel. How to distinguish, how to differentiate the New Caledonian nickel in the working groups? Which are the performance levers, even if that's an ugly word, to ensure that the New Caledonian nickel would be more appealing than the others? Sébastien Lafargue, possibly on the question of optimizing resource and reserve. In your group, is that a subject that you discussed? Well, we discussed this in terms of optimization, optimizing the resource. We understood this as an ore body, as a mineral resource, so optimizing the nickel resource that we have available to us here, but also in terms of natural resource. We talked about biodiversity, for instance, agricultural land, places, taboo places, sacred places, places that are culturally relevant, places that are important in terms of tourism or landscapes, where you don't want to see landscapes destroyed or changed by mining. The question that then comes up is that of the value that you attribute to the various things. Is biodiversity, as mentioned by Mr. Géraux earlier on, is that an absolute value where you cannot do anything, or can we do something there? That's a real question, a question that requires an answer. And nickel, today, in New Caledonia is closely associated with the institutional future of New Caledonia. Mr. Santa's approach and initiative was quite interesting because it put this issue, which is highly relevant for New Caledonia, at the core of the debate, and for civil society as well, not only for politicians. I would like to say that nickel is too serious a subject to be left in the only hands of politicians. It's quite important for civil society to engage here as well and to start working on this. it's important to have a vision for the future. Which place should nickel have in New Caledonia? Should it participate in the territory's economy or not? Or should we prioritize something else? Do we want to gear the development of the territory towards something else? And it would be useful to think about green nickel. Green nickel, that is certainly something that holds promise for the future. And we now need to work on wondering, where do we start? How do we engage and how do we support the way there? Now, on green nickel, last week we talked about the place of New Caledonian nickel in the world. Vincent Ménard, I'll give you the floor in a minute. The question is that there's currently other nickel-producing countries, China, for instance, to name it, with their capacity to green their industry, not in New Caledonia. And is it possible to do so, to highlight what is being done, and then to showcase this around the world? And there's the international side to be taken into consideration. Yeah, Vincent Ménard, you wanted to contribute on this matter.
Indeed, it's quite relevant to differentiate from the competition, but we need to do things better than others to emerge successfully. We have some natural assets, we have a high grade, we have I was going to say an industrial structure that's quite relevant with well-established miners, small miners that have been operating for a long time. We have undertaken many efforts, taken measures to produce this nickel in an environmentally, say, acceptable way, or far more acceptable than quite a few other countries. So we're already standing here in a good place. And now it's about to ramp up and to increase, I was going to say, our differentiation. China undertakes a lot of effort as well. So there's different ways to emerge successfully here on quantities as well. We already extract quite a lot of nickel, 250,000 tons of contained nickel a year. We could certainly do much more. I certainly believe that it would be a good thing to do so. So that would enable us to be more visible. And then in terms of quality, we certainly need to capitalize on the fact that at this stage there's pressure, a relevant pressure, important pressure coming from many actors, EU Commission, major investment funds like BlackRock and others, many other actors exercising efforts, pushing for greener nickel. The head of the LME, London Metal Exchange, Mr. Chamberlain, said some time ago that soon all of nickel should be traceable. We would not be able to accept nickel of doubtful origins anymore. The Larry Fink of BlackRock, the largest investment fund with billions invested in companies in this fund, that's now taken action against those businesses that don't have a CSR plan. And not so because they would suddenly have become very environmentally friendly. It's just that under the pressure of at the international level, there's fines, there's clients cancelling orders, and so that has an impact. The EU Commission, and so we need to capitalize on that trend. Right. So the question that arises here, and I can see one, those who are interested in nickel, I know it's the case for you and for those who worked with you, we quite often see comparative costs, cash costs. We see business by business, from one business to another, the production costs. And with competitors, these are the businesses based in Indonesia, in the Philippines, or product costs in other countries. could we envisage that tomorrow New Caledonia would come out with the same comparative costs, but with another CSER approach to say that the New Caledonian nickel is more virtuous? Hubert, I'd like to turn to you first, and then I'll talk to you, Mickaël, because we're just talking about a fund, and I'd like to know how funds invest their money. Hubert Géraux, can we draft an international CSER comparison to actually plot New Caledonia on such a map, on a chart? Well, that's an interesting idea. We briefly addressed this in terms of benchmarking of CSER practice around the world. It would have required a far more sustainable and substantial piece of work. It's about positioning, placing New Caledonia in that regard. But we need to understand what we mean when we say CSER. Is this only corporate responsibility? Or is that, broadly speaking, the CSR of the country or the territory that's hosting this business? That is something we've also looked into, the CSER of a country or of a territory that can be expressed in its regulation, enforcement, and strategic vision. And therefore, this is certainly a work area that needs to be addressed. There's a true challenge there to go there. So, to react here, I'll give you the floor again in a second. So does that mean that we could envisage tomorrow a marketing campaign, PR campaign pushed by New Caledonia as a whole to promote these practices in the world? Is this what you're referring to? Or would that be a more corporate initiative, media campaigns organized by the businesses with a specialized press? Well, I'm certainly not a PR expert. But before you do the marketing, once the work is done, once you've achieved this, you need to communicate, you need to report about this, but the work needs to be done upstream. And there's two very important aspects here. We saw that in our workspace, that there's CSER spaces looking to the social side of nickel, which are considered less relevant. People were saying that the environmental aspect is more irrelevant, but there are still two major work areas. The challenge is, and I said so before, to reduce the footprint of this, the environmental footprint of this industry on water. We have 600 kilometers of water streams where sedimentation takes place. So that's an important thing. But the other aspect would be, for instance, the CO2, the carbon footprint. We would be able to communicate properly if we engage with the metallurgical industry and bring them towards renewable energies. You can't go and sell nickel for the energy transition in the world if you produce it with coal. So there's the energy transition. It's a matter of consistency. Consistency for there to have a group of actors that understand that this takes us on the right way. Well, that leads me to the discussion about the fund, because this is intergenerational solidarity, an intergenerational fund. This would be done today and would serve us in tomorrow. We can look to Norway, this colossal fund that selects its investments against this criterion of sustainable acceptability. There are things that are barred from financing by this fund. They are blacklisted there. So if we talk about us, New Caledonia, could we envisage a similar approach? For instance, be it in terms of funds investment or positioning or strategic objectives, the green nickel, etc. Are we mature enough to think in those terms, Mickaël, Jamet, or is this something that addresses an area that hasn't been looked into yet? Well, I believe that it'll require more work before answering the question, how do you invest the fund and where do you invest them? Other questions need to be asked. So, for instance, the sizing of the fund. What amounts do we need for the future generations? It will depend on the population, the amount that we need to put aside for future generations. The question, how do we finance the fund? A new tax, or do we sideline part of the existing tax? Once these questions have had an answer, then who will invest? Will this be done directly by the fund, or do we decide to work with a trust? All these questions have to be looked into upstream ahead of time before we actually go there. And then where we're going to place the funds will depend indeed on our willingness or on our desire. If we wish to enter into an approach of greening, for instance, taxation of the fund or anything like that, we will prioritize investments in markets that meet these expectations, because the investments can be done on, say, very risk-free, risk-averse areas. We can invest in risky areas. We can also invest into businesses, buy shares in certain industries. So many options can be envisaged. And this participation could only be geared towards businesses that act in a green way or have virtuous approaches in their operations. On these practices, I have 3 more questions, so we're slowly moving towards the Q&A session. I've received a few questions and I'll ask them. But the first question I'd like to ask is that of governance. We heard Javier Capapé tell us very clearly, unambiguously, the political powers should have no discretionary authority over the fund. So in clear terms, you put the money in the fund, you have a global pact that clearly states what the money is there for, and it's in a black box, and you can't touch the money in the box until the particular action that it was earmarked for is there. So is this something, are we mature enough to have such a conversation? Earlier on, Dominique Lefeivre was telling us that it may possibly necessary to look into outside consultancies, outside support. Do we have all the resources here, or will we need help on this matter? Mickaël, Jamet, possibly, but it's also a matter of the one-stop point of contact or skills development. Well, are we mature? Yes. Most certainly. We're certainly not less mature than other countries. Other countries have managed to do so, so we can certainly do so. The question of support, quite obviously, since this is something new, would make sense to actually get the support from experts like Mr. Capapé, for instance, if and it's up to us to define the governance system we want. But what's relevant here is that the day we create a fund, we need to work on the transparency of the fund. And for instance, to adhere to the Santiago principles, access for the public with regard to information held by the fund, annual reports, what do we do with the fund, where's the money invested, with a supervision appropriately organized, and then governance arrangements that need to be appropriate. But most certainly, I mean, there's no reason why New Caledonia would not be mature enough to ensure a good governance of such a fund. Very interesting. Same question on training. And quickly, because otherwise we're going into overtime. Are we, Pascal Velasquez, are we now, Velasco, are we ready to actually go there? In the previous roundtable, we were saying, oh, it's easier said than done. What do you say? Can we now engage into this approach? Can we start? Well, we said about time management before, it doesn't make sense. And then we need data. And that's why I believe, we believe in our group that there's still work to be done to refine the data, to see where we're going and how over time we undertake all the work that needs to be done. And it is necessary to keep going and to keep collecting data. So we were talking about the single point of contact.
And I don't know if it needs to be geared towards one area or another, or industry or another. It's quite interesting what has been said. It actually needs to be operations driven. It needs to be operational. Otherwise, it won't serve any purpose. It will be one more entity. And I believe that the industry needs to be an actor. All the people in the industry need to be actors in this. And then how can we regulate? Otherwise, it's going to be inefficient. It's just going to be one more measure out of many. But at this stage, we certainly need to start work to become operational. So again, we're talking governance, quite obviously. Vincent Ménard, on the economic benefits. What's next? If there's a future here. Well, as I was saying before, the EASY study only looked at the private sector and hasn't really gone to the end of its inquiries, because the study was undertaken very quickly. So we need to pursue the worker, and now we have a certain number of people, 15,000 people in the private sector. There's probably people in the public sector, and then others in the private sector that we can certainly, I wouldn't say we look for them, but we identify them. And then in terms of studies that were undertaken, what was also interesting was that there's obviously a social aspect in the study undertaken by ISE. I was pleasantly surprised, because in the nickel sector, 1 job out of 2 is actually held by Melanesians. And that means insertion, social insertion, climbing the social ladder, being able to be lifted in the social scale, in the social ladder. In the average of the various economies, 1 out of 10 are held, 1 job out of 10 is held by Melanesians. In nickel, 1 out of 2. So that clearly plays a part in the social scale, in the social ladder. And here we do certainly have questions that arise about youth, etc. I believe that nickel has a role to play, a potentially phenomenal role to play. Often we talk about RSMA and youth, etc. But I believe that training in mines certainly has a role to play, a very interesting role to play. This would enable the development of the nickel economy, for it to play a social role. And in those studies, with the arrival of electric vehicles, with the Green Deal that are being talked about right now, we should align our nickel doctrine to a nickel policy to really update things and seize all these opportunities. So we know where to start here. Many subjects have been mentioned. So I'll close with the questions now. I've got 2 or 3, and then I've got a closing question that I want to ask you before giving the floor to the president for his closing words. Question about GPEC, so the forecasting of jobs and skills. Sébastien is asking whether a mapping has been done of tools to collect capacities and match that with the needs. Have you centralized this mapping? Well, that's what I was saying earlier on. It was a bit complex, because indeed the people in the industry, we were going through a difficult time for the industry. Information was fragmented in terms of method. We tried to really reach out, send out questionnaires to hear back. And it's true that we had quite fragmented returns. So what we find is that this forecasting of jobs and skills is something really that's really just budding in some businesses. In other industries, in other businesses, there's none at all. So that's why I was saying earlier on that we should talk about these jobs and skills forecasting for the industry as a whole, because each go about this forecasting in their own way. There's business strategies. Each can have their own forecasting strategies for the jobs that they will need. But it would be useful to have a shared method, a joint method, to have an overview of the entire territory in terms of jobs and skills forecasting, and that would enable us to be far more effective and to save money too. Thank you, Pascal. Question for Hubert.
Hubert. Sébastien is asking, again Sébastien, you talked about 90% lost forests. What type of forest is this about? Very briefly, because this is not the core question, but possibly you could possibly help us here. Well, there's different types of forests in New Caledonia. To keep it simple, dry forest, wet forest, and on the mining grounds, by geology, we have unique forests around the world. And what existed 3,000 years ago, there's only 10% left. So the challenge is now, where do we extract? Why don't we expect? Because there's other resources, other things, biodiversity, water, agriculture, culture, that actually are have priority over nickel. And that will create different value to nickel, where we say we dig here, but we don't dig here. And there will be a territory consistency and an international consistency that we can communicate about. Well, that is true not only for New Caledonia, but also internationally speaking. That's right. So then, question to Dominique, unfortunately had to leave us. He had to leave this meeting because he had another very important meeting immediately after this. A question that was asked, I don't know if somebody else can answer. Question from Fleur. The fact that you call upon these consultancy firms, these independent consultancy firms, to assess applications, to compensate for the insufficiency of the administration, is that really the right answer? And can we trust in an international consultancy firm? That's the first part of the question. Second part of the question is, would the situation not be much healthier if the local governments did not do business with nickel? So there's a lot of undertone here. I don't know who I'd like to start with. I'd like to say that this is really a matter that relates to the one-stop point of contact. Would anyone feel like answering this? This is Hubert. Hubert, please go ahead. We can't hear you. You need to switch on your microphone. Well, sorry. Just to talk about the second part of the question, I'm certainly not competent to answer the first one on a single point of contact, but it's quite obvious that we're now moving into an interesting challenge where the governments are increasingly judge and jury on the question of nickel management, of these environmental impacts, and of optimizing their revenue. And de facto, this is a real issue that needs to be addressed without any fear. But if we want to have a virtuous and transparent industry, we need to have tools to ensure good governance in the choices, in the management choices that are made in the society, in the environment, while still using the revenue, the benefits of nickel. Well, in Fleur's question and the other questions that we addressed in at least two roundtables, there's the connotation of competition between governments, and it would be quite surprising to imagine a competition between our governments. So now a question, Vincent, is the ISE study available to the broader public? Is it going to be published? Well, it's my understanding that yes. But because the study was undertaken quite quickly, there's already been comments about the fact that it may actually be subject to some corrections before it's published, yes. Well, another brief question with regard to the organization that I can answer. Nickel.Nc is not only the initiative, it's also the website where each group should upload the documents they have produced. Each group has followed their own approach, their own methods, synthesis notes, presentations, etc. Very diverse format. We've let each group to work themselves. So what's the space left for that? Each group has created their own folder, their own file, and they can be uploaded. But under, of course, the proviso that we get the green light from the administration. There's 30, 40 studies that have never been centralized, put in a central spot, and we're waiting for the green light of all the various owners of these studies because that placement in a central repository has never taken place. Before I give the President the floor for his closing words, I'd like to ask everybody a very simple question. What in your now time as lead in Nickel.Nc, what's the legacy? What will remain of Nickel.Nc? And if so, what will remain? So
Hubert Géraux, possibly starting with CSR. Well, very quickly. Certainly a cultural leap. We've learned a lot about the question. I would like to welcome everybody who took part in the conversation, the experts, the broader public, the stakeholders, and the knowledge about this has clearly increased. Different visions, different perceptions, different apprehensions of the subjects, but it clearly shows how useful it is to actually build something together which would be on a more sustainable trajectory itinerary in the future. Thank you. Sébastien Lafargue, in optimizing resource and reserve, what is the legacy of Nickel.Nc for you? Well, to me, this is the starting point of a broader, overarching discussion, community discussion, the place nickel should have in our territory. And as I said earlier on, it's quite revealing to say that everybody can take part in the conversation, but this needs to lead to a true long-term vision in this territory that will be guided by the politicians. What do we want to do with nickel in New Caledonia? What must be the place of nickel in New Caledonia? And then following up on that, all the arsenal, all the tools, all the actions, the measures that will actually support this and develop in that space, aiming at achieving that vision. Thank you very much, Sébastien. Pascal Velasco in the group skills development. Same question. Well, I'd say that it's been extremely interesting. It provides an overarching view, a bird's eye view of, we've all seen snippets of it, but this gave us quite a complementary vision, even if we don't necessarily agree on the views, but it allows us to identify complementarity, and in this space, this was very interesting because we learned a lot as well. Thank you, Pascal, Mickaël, Jamet. The group, what fund for future generations, question mark? Well, on the question of the fund only, what we can state is that a lot of work remains to be done before we can build a fund. That is a clear finding, and then I share the opinion of the other participants. The merit of Nickel.Nc is that it generated the sharing of this knowledge from completely diverse perspectives and to see the bridges between these positions, and that has been extremely positive. Then from the tax point of view, as the head of taxation in New Caledonia, the approach is quite interesting when we talk about the greening of taxation. This is something that's been talked about. Adapting taxation to those virtuous businesses, that is something that could be quite interesting in the future. Thank you, Mickaël. Vincent Ménard, the group on economic benefits of mining and metallurgical activities. Same question. What will remain of Nickel.Nc? Well, what I do hope for is that we'll be able to really take this as a basis, take this effort as a starting point. I believe that we're really here in a situation where we need to seize the opportunity. It's like we have a train to catch. There's this technological leap with electric vehicles that's now coming up with this very strong pressure, this strong support for green nickel. We need to really bank on this. We need to capitalize on this. We need to produce more, to produce better. And if by acting through this way, we can actually contribute to the social development of our workforce, that's also good. So we need to capitalize on this, draft action plans, and go there. Well, I would like now to close in thanking all of you as leads, but thanking all the organizations that supported our work. And I'll now give the floor to the President of the Government for his closing words. I suppose that you followed our conversations with great interest. There was a bit of a call to politicians. President, you have the floor. Thank you, Jean-Marc. I'd like to, first of all, thank, of course, all the leads who worked over these recent months and almost a year on these issues. and all the groups that participated in the work. Possibly also a direct word of thanks to you and Virginie for the strategic side. I'm certainly not omitting my staff here, Corinne, who helped me substantially. Well, quite honestly, I believe that we've achieved the aim that we set ourselves, the goal that we set out with this common knowledge base, be it only by the creation of this website, this Nickel.Nc website. I believe that this creates, this constitutes this common shared knowledge base, even though I understand following this last roundtable that there's more information to be fed here. I do hope sincerely that the 17th government of New Caledonia will actually keep following in this vein and will keep going in this direction, and that this shared knowledge base will actually keep growing. I hope that the political decision makers who we are and the future political decision makers will look at this website, will read what is available in this website. Not everybody was involved. All this is made available in this website. And everybody can actually find information there to start thinking tomorrow about this nickel strategy, which is dear to all of our hearts, quite obviously. And this is something that's quite symbolic of the approach. I hope that everybody was, and I believe that everybody was satisfied with the sharing, with the coming together. Many of us were experts in their respective fields, but the simple fact of bringing people around the table, to bring them around the table to share their knowledge, including with other stakeholders. I believe that that has really been appreciated, and that was probably the core purpose of my desire when I instigated this Nickel.Nc approach, including with very diverse opinions. One of the leads was just saying that a while ago, putting people around the same table, even if they come from very diverse opinions, to ensure that things can make progress. So as I was saying, I'm under the impression that we really achieved the aim that we set ourselves, even if there's still work to do. Clearly under the impression that we have a better understanding of nickel in New Caledonia and internationally, having international speakers, exceptional speakers. I'm talking about Stéphane Rodon, talking about Mr. Kapapé this morning. And this shared knowledge base can also serve to feed this work domestically here in New Caledonia and in the international space. This then leads to the political choices that will need to be made. And I do hope that these choices will be enlightened with everything that is available and that they will be the best for the future of New Caledonia. Thank you again to everybody who was involved. Just to tell the listeners, thank you very much for attending this meeting. Thank you very much, President. And to those who missed Javier Capapé's interview, you can watch it again online. Thank you very much.